Many of us have those stubborn pounds that seem impossible to lose, no matter how good we eat or how hard we work out. My solution is PlushCare. PlushCare is a leading telehealth provider with doctors who are there for you day and night to partner with you in your weight loss journey. They can prescribe FDA-approved weight loss medications like Wegovy and Zepbound for those who qualify. Plus, they accept most insurance plans. To get started, visit plushcare.com/weightloss. That's plushcare.com/weightloss.
Hello and welcome to episode number 238 of Real Life Ghost Stories. And to kick things off this week, I would like to thank some of our newest Patreon subscribers. I would like to thank Janet Hughes, Maria Ferguson, Rose, Abby Worth, and Nick Mack. Or it could be Nick MC. I'm sorry if it's the latter, but I don't always get these things right. But thank you all so much for subscribing to the Patreon. As always, I love you and appreciate you every single day. And our film review this week, our film review is Monstrous. Monstrous was released in 2022. It has 4.7 out of 10 on IMDb and 54% on Rotten Tomatoes. A terrifying new horror awaits Laura, Christina Ricci, and her 7-year-old son Cody when they flee her abusive ex-husband and try to settle into a new life in an idyllic and remote lakeside farmhouse. Still traumatised, their physical and mental well-being are pushed to the limit as their fragile existence is threatened. Look, I'm going to be honest from the off. I have very little to say about this film, either good or bad. It was decidedly nothingy. Do you know? But for the sake of the review, I will give my likes and dislikes. So for my likes, I did like the setup of this film. So you have a film that centres around some sort of real life trauma and the physical implications of this and the mental implications of this. So you know that Christina Ricci's character and her son have sort of fled from an abusive ex, and that's all you know. And look, if I'm saying Christina Ricci's name wrong, I'm sorry. I always thought it was Ricci, but now I'm not so sure. But people fleeing from an abusive ex is a story that is all too common. That is a real life horror that is all too common. And I respect a film that centres around real life trauma. I respect a horror film that goes, hey, this is a very real horror that happens to very real people. And Christina Ricci is definitely a vampire, first of all. There's no way that woman is whatever age she is and still looks the same. Who is her doctor? How does she look so fresh? I'm aware that I just said fresh there, like I'm some sort of raging cannibal, and I apologise for it. But besides me marvelling at how young she looks in this story, I thought she did an okay performance in this. There is this sort of palpable strain of her trying to keep it all together and create this perfect life after all the trauma they've been through. The film has that 1950s veneer of the idyllic life and the perfect family, and she has all these perfect outfits and she looks perfect all the time. And then of course, deep down she has all of this trauma that is rattling around inside her. But I definitely don't think they utilised her to the best of their ability. I don't know if it was like a weak script or maybe it wasn't the right part for her. But I just thought she was okay. I didn't think she was that great. And besides that, I like a film that tries to represent trauma with some sort of physical monster in the style of like The Babadook. I like it. I respect it. Did they do it particularly well in this film? No, I don't think they did. That was my likes column done and dusted, to be honest. And in my dislikes column, the first thing I wrote was, it was mercifully short. Because it is a very short film, and I don't know how they managed to make it so incredibly boring in such a short film. It sort of felt like everything was really slow for a lot of the time, and then for the last kind of 15 minutes it was like bam, 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 with all of this information and big reveal, and I was like, well, why didn't you just spread it out more. I don't know, because it just was a lot of nothing. A lot of me watching Christina Ricci in nice outfits. And obviously her little boy is a big part of the story as well. Her little boy Cody. And he's kind of a linchpin of the story. And look, like, he was grand. Do you know what I mean? He was fine. He wasn't the worst child actor, but he also certainly wasn't the best. And to be really honest, I figured out what was happening really early on. And that's not a brag. Do you know what I mean? That's not me being like, I am so intelligent, I can figure out these horror films in no time at all. I think I've just seen too many horror films, right? So once I realised what was going on, I was kind of like, oh, okay, let's cut to the chase here. Let's get to the big reveal. And look, after watching this film, I realised it had over 40 producers. And I thought that kind of goes some way to explaining why it was so convoluted and didn't really make much sense. Or maybe it just didn't make as much sense as they thought it did. It felt to me like they had the ending of this story but didn't quite know how to get there. So there were lots of elements of it that just fundamentally, when you looked back, didn't actually make much sense. It's the type of film that you should want to watch twice. You should be like, oh, what did I miss? I need to pick out clues for what was going on. But actually, I just don't want to watch it again. I was like, oh, fine, yeah, whatever. I don't actually care about this film. It was quite boring. And I also fell into the trap of having quite a unique idea for a monster, like this lake creature, which I was totally on board with, but showing said lake creature far too early and far too much, which took away from the power of the creature and the impact of the creature. And I say that all the time in horror films. Don't show whatever it is that is haunting or stalking or hunting, whatever it is, just don't show it. I don't really know what else to say about this film. I kind of expected more from it. I expected more from Christina Ricci. If I'm saying her name wrong and people know how to say her name right, I know they are wincing. They are wincing every time I say Christina Ricci. So I'm sorry. I'm sorry if it's wrong. It was grand. I wouldn't watch it again. If you've got time to spare, then why not? It's a short film, but it's definitely not one of the best films I've seen. It's a big fat 2.5 stars from me.
Hey, Dave.
Yeah, Randy.
Since we founded Bombas, we've always said our socks, underwear, and T-shirts are super soft. Any new ideas?
Maybe sublimely soft.
Or disgustingly cozy.
Wait, what?
I got it. Bombas. Absurdly comfortable essentials for yourself
and for those facing homelessness.
Because one purchased equals one donated.
Wow, did we just write an ad?
Yes.
Bombas. Big comfort for everyone. Go to bombas.com/ACAST and use code ACAST for 20% off your first purchase.
Millions of people have lost weight with personalized plans from Noom. Like Evan, who can't stand salads and still lost 50 pounds.
Salads generally for most people are the easy button, right? For me, that wasn't an option. I never really was a salad guy. That's just not who I am. But Noom worked for me.
Get your personalized plan today at Noom.com. Real Noom user compensated to provide their story. In 4 weeks, the typical Noom user can expect to lose 1 to 2 pounds per week. Individual results may vary.
Gosh, that really was the shortest film review that I've done in quite a while. Yeah, just a very, very boring film. Very non-entity-ish film. And that brings us to our stories this week. So obviously, a couple of weeks ago, I did some Timeslip stories. And I decided not to do the Timeslips 2 weeks in a row because I thought, maybe people don't want Timeslips 2 weeks in a row. And when I was researching for that episode, I found loads of other Timeslip stories. And the first story that we are going to cover today is a story that has come up multiple times, but I've never actually covered it on the podcast, which I was surprised about. So you'll probably be like, I recognise details of this story. But yeah, like I said, never actually covered it in full. And I don't think that I've covered any of these other stories on the podcast before, but you never know. I've been doing this for 5 years. I've got multiple episodes on Timeslip, so who knows? So I apologise if you've heard any of these stories before, but let's get into it. In 1911, an adventure was published, and it contained a story of a time slip that has remained in the public consciousness ever since, at least among paranormal enthusiasts. Charlotte Ann Elizabeth Moberly and Eleanor Frances Jourdain were both English academics and were well respected in their fields. Both women were principals of St. Hugh's College, Oxford at different times. In 1901, the pair spent the summer together in Paris. The idea was that they would get to know each other and Moberly could decide whether it was appropriate to hire Jourdain as her deputy in St. Hugh's College. Moberly wanted to see if they would work well together, share similar ideas and interests, etc., before committing to the hire. It was the 10th of August 1901 when the incident happened. But the women would write down their memory of what happened independently 3 months later. The women had visited the Palace of Versailles and were pretty disappointed with the building itself, so they decided to do a little stroll around the grounds. They both wrote that they had passed to the left of the Grand Trianon. Instead of following the leafy green drive, they took a small laneway. Moberly wrote that she saw a woman who was shaking out a white cloth out one of the windows of the building. She recalled that she was surprised that Jourdain did not speak to this woman, as Jourdain had good French and could have asked her for directions. But Jourdain did not see this woman. She instead described that they passed some farm buildings and noted that there were some farm implements lying around, one of which was an old-fashioned looking plough. It was at this point, when they were faced with 3 different pathways, that Jourdain realised that they were lost. They chose the central path, and while making their way along it, they passed 2 men in long greyish-green coats with small 3-cornered hats. They assumed that these men were gardeners. Jourdain asked them for directions, and the men told them to continue straight, in a tone that Jourdain described as casual and mechanical. Jourdain then noticed a girl of about 13 or 14 standing in the doorway of a cottage with a woman that appeared to be her mother. They were oddly dressed, wearing bodices, with kerchiefs tucked under them. The mother was in the process of passing a jug to her daughter. The 2 tourists then entered a wood, where the mood and atmosphere suddenly changed. There was a garden kiosk with a man sitting near it, and both women were completely assailed by feelings of sudden loneliness and depression. Moberly wrote, "The place was so shut in that we could not see beyond it. Everything suddenly looked unnatural, therefore unpleasant. Even the trees behind the building seemed to have become flat and lifeless, like a woodworked-in tapestry. There was no effects of light and shade, and no wind stirring the trees. It was all intensely still. The man was cloaked, and he turned and looked at Moberly, who was utterly shocked by the feelings that he stirred in her. He exuded evil, and wore an odious expression. His face was pockmarked and rough, and his skin was sallow. Suddenly, a handsome young man appeared. He was running towards the 2 women, and again they took note of his dress. He was wearing a large brimmed Spanish hat and buckled shoes. He spoke to the women in French, but Jourdain struggled to understand what he was saying because he spoke with an unfamiliar accent. He wore an odd smile on his face, and from what Jourdain could understand, he was saying that they did not need to be there, so they followed his directions. They continued through the woods until they came to the Petit Trianon, which was a small, fine country house on the grounds. On its terrace there was a lady, who was holding a piece of paper at arm's length and sketching. This woman looked at the 2 tourists. She was pretty and fair-haired. She was wearing a white hat and a summer dress, and had a handkerchief-like arrangement on her shoulders over her bodice. She was wearing a fichu, which was a scarf-type object wrapped around her shoulders. Her outfit was old-fashioned and struck Moberly as highly unusual. Jourdain did not see the woman. but as they approached the terrace, she had this sense that there was somebody there that she could not see. A small boy emerged from an adjoining house and brought the women back to where they had first started. Everything had returned to normal, and they entered a carriage to leave. They did not speak to each other about what had happened. A week later, Moberly asked Jourdain whether she had felt that the Petit Trianon was haunted. Jourdain responded with an immediate yes. It was not until 3 months later, when they were discussing their walk around Versailles, that they realised that Moberly had seen the strangely dressed woman sketching on the terrace, but Jourdain had not seen her. They knew that something strange had happened to them on that day. August the 10th was the anniversary of the last day of freedom for the French royals, and the pair were told by a French friend that there was a story that was told that on that day, on the anniversary of the last day of freedom for the French royal family, Marie Antoinette could still be seen sitting outside the Petit Trianon, and that all around the grounds, her servants could be seen engaging in their usual activities. Moberly wrote, "We wondered whether we had inadvertently entered within an act of the Queen's memory when alive, and whether this explained our curious sensation of being shut in and oppressed. What more likely, we thought, than that during those hours in the hall of the assembly or in the conciergerie she had gone back in such vivid memory to other Augusts spent at Trianon that some impress of it was imparted to the place." But that's not the end of the story. In January 1902, Jourdain made a second visit back to the Petit Trianon. It all seemed completely normal until she crossed a bridge, heading to the Hameau de la Reine, where all of a sudden she felt as though she had crossed over some invisible line. She could see 2 labourers who were filling a cart with sticks. They were wearing tunics and capes and had hoods of red and blue. She looked away for a split second and these men were gone. There was no trace of them having ever been there. As she continued, she felt as though she were walking in a crowd. She couldn't see anyone, but she could feel and hear people passing her by and hear faint traces of the words they were saying to each other. She could hear music, as if a distant band were playing, as if the sound were coming from a phonograph, the pitch and tone slightly off. When she returned to the palace and inquired whether there was a band scheduled to play, she was informed that there was no band scheduled to play that day. She wrote down the music notes that she could remember. Moberly and Jourdain visited Versailles multiple times and noted that the routes and objects that they had seen in their original visit were no longer there. In 1908, Jourdain visited Petit Trianon again, and as she was walking past the guards' lodgings, she saw 2 women arguing. Jourdain wrote, "Suddenly and utterly unexpectedly, I knew that some indefinable change had taken place. I felt as though I were being taken up into another condition of things. I turned at once to look back and saw the gates near which they were sitting melting away, and the background of trees again becoming visible through them, as on our original visit. But I noticed that the side pillars were standing steady. These pillars were old, and probably had not been renewed since their original erection. The whole scene, the sky, trees and buildings, gave a little shiver, like the movement of a curtain or of scenery at a theatre. At the same time, the old difficulty of walking on and of making any way reproduced itself, together with the feeling of depression described in 1901 and 1902. Moberly and Jourdain researched their experience extensively. They believed that the man they had seen, that they believed was evil, was the Comte de Vaudreuil. He was an ambitious courtier, and Marie Antoinette despised him. He was mixed race and had pockmarked skin. The Versailles Timeslip is one of the most famous timeslips even today. After looking at portraits of Marie Antoinette, Moberly believed that this was the woman she had seen sketching on the terrace. When the pair went to see some traditional French theatre, they noticed that the costumes of some of the extras were identical to the outfits that were worn by the men they assumed were gardeners. They also identified several aspects of their experiences as being from the time of the Revolution. The Versailles Timeslip account is probably the most famous timeslip account out there, and of course there is much criticism of these accounts. Some say that because they did not write their accounts until 3 months after the incident, that their memory of what happened could have been influenced by their research. But then there was also criticism that they were lesbians and therefore more prone to delusions. A well-known fact about lesbians. Whatever the case may be, it seems that these women experienced something, and it does demonstrate that we have been experiencing timeslips for a long time, and that timeslips are a popular phenomenon. When the adventure was published, it sold out and was reprinted multiple times in both English and French. So we're going to pause there briefly before we get into the other stories. To be clear, just want to say, I don't actually think that lesbians are more prone to delusions. That was a joke, in case anyone thinks that I've suddenly taken a deep dive into the world of homophobia. And also in Pride Month, it would be a bit of a kick in the teeth to then start making big claims about lesbians. I did just think it was really funny that one of the reasons they were like, lesbians delusional, famously. So their story isn't true because lesbians. I'm pretty sure that someone actually wrote a report about these two women. Firstly, that they were lesbians and that they engaged in, or they attempted to pursue students for lesbian affairs. Not cool for a person in a position of power to pursue their students for relationships, lesbian or otherwise. But also the part of the report was like, and they're lesbians together. When they were in Paris, they were doing lesbian things, so their brains were addled. But look, lesbians are not. We're not exclusionary on this podcast, and I think that lesbians too can experience time slips. Okay? But outside of that, like in all seriousness, I'm kind of in two minds about this one. I do think it's weird that they didn't discuss their experiences at all for 3 months, or they didn't write it down for 3 months. Like, whatever about not writing it down, but all they talked about was a week later. One of them was like, hey, do you think that place was haunted? And the other one's like, yeah. And then that's it. They don't talk about it again. I don't know. I feel like if you're there with your pal, you're knocking around Versailles, you'd be like, you'd come out, get into the carriage and go, Jesus, that was a fucking weird place, wasn't it? Like, what were them fellas wearing? Did you see our one sitting on the terrace sketching? I don't know. I just feel like you'd say something. And I do wonder genuinely, like, they had a lot of time to think about their experience, like sort of individually, independently, and they had a lot of time to research. And I'm not saying they went away and researched the revolutionary period and then they were like, oh yeah, we had this time slip. But I wonder how much of what they then wrote down was a case of confirmation bias. Like, how much were the lines blurred between what they potentially researched and what actually happened, and whether what they wrote down happened was subconsciously or consciously informed by their research. And I think probably subconsciously. I think they wrote this down because they really believed what had happened to them. Subsequent research from people who were really interested and invested in this story has suggested that the things that they saw don't actually fit the revolutionary time period and seem to come from an earlier time period. And I guess the revolutionary period in France is an incredibly famous time period, so it's kind of almost romantic to imagine what life would have been like on that last day of freedom for the royals. Also, I do apologise wholeheartedly for my French pronunciation or lack thereof. I didn't even try, because I just thought I'm never going to be able to get it right. So I'm just not even going to try. Okay. So I'm sorry to any French speakers that are listening who shuddered every time I said a French word incorrectly. And I actually personally haven't read this book. The information for this story came from a brilliant article on PSI encyclopedia.spr.ac.uk, and as per all of the stories that I talk about on this podcast, the link is in the description for the original source. And it was a really, really detailed, really interesting article in which they also talked about the problems with this story. And one of the problems that is kind of regularly cited as a reason as to why people think this might potentially have been exaggerated, maybe not made up, but exaggerated, is that they wrote a chapter in their book which was this sort of weird meditative imagining of Marie Antoinette sitting on her terrace and seeing two out of place women, so they imagined, or they sort of meditated and said, well, this is what would have happened for Marie Antoinette, and she's sitting on the terrace drawing, and she's like, who are these strangely dressed women? And I think for a lot of people who read it, they were like, oh God, it felt like it weakened their plausibility for a lot of people. And I can see why they did it. I can see why they thought that would be an interesting chapter to include. Like, what would Marie Antoinette have thought of these two women that sort of appeared and seemed out of place? Did she experience them? But I can also see why it made people raise their eyebrows. And I can also see why the women saying the woman on the terrace was definitely Marie Antoinette, obviously an incredibly famous historical figure. I can see why the women saying it was her would also make people raise their eyebrows. So it's a very famous story, and I think probably these women experienced something. The thing that interests me most about their story is not them seeing Marie Antoinette or this evil guy with the pockmarked face. The thing that interested me was their description of the world around them. The woods around them suddenly becoming kind of still and silent, and there was no breeze, and everything seemed like it was almost carved out of wood, like this backdrop that didn't seem real. And there's always this hazy, dreamlike quality to these time slip stories. That's the bit that I think is most interesting. But listen, who are we to listen to the testimony of two lesbians? And the second and third story today come from a website called Historic Kent, but I actually got the stories via the Wayback Machine, so the website no longer exists, but you can read the original articles in, again, the links that are in the description of this episode. So let's get into the second story today. On the morning of the 18th of June 1968, an elderly lady, Mrs. Charlotte Warburton, went shopping with her husband in the town of Tunbridge Wells in Kent in England. They decided to go their separate ways for a while and to meet up later. That morning, unable to find a particular brand of coffee from her usual grocer, she went into a supermarket in Calverley Road. As she entered the shop, she saw a small cafe through an entrance in the left-hand wall. She had never before realised that there was a cafe there. It was rather old-fashioned with wood-panelled walls. There were no windows, and the room was lit by a number of electric bulbs with frosted shades. There was at the time, she thought, nothing especially odd about the scene. Two women in rather long dresses were sitting at one table, and about half a dozen men, all in dark lounge suits, were sitting at the other tables further back in the room, she said. All the people seemed to be drinking coffee and chatting, a normal sight for a country town at 11 o'clock in the morning. Mrs. Warburton did not stay, but she certainly did not recognise anything amiss either, then or indeed for several days. Even the rather formal and slightly off-key clothing made no immediate impression on her, nor did the fact that although the customers were talking, there was no noise from them to cause her to question her senses. nor did she notice that there was no smell of coffee. There is clearly something strange here. Yet, without questioning the circumstances in which she found herself, Mrs. Warburton blithely left the cafe and went to meet her husband, and she did not suggest to him that the scene at the cafe seemed in any way odd. When they came to Tunbridge Wells on their next shopping expedition, Mrs. Warburton decided to take her husband to the cafe, or rather she hoped to take him there. But of course they never did find the place, though they searched the street up and down. No, they were told, in the supermarket, there was no cafe there. She must be in the wrong building. It was then that they learned about the Cosmos Cinema, which had stood on the site of the supermarket. They were then directed to the Tunbridge Wells Constitutional Club, where the steward told them that at one time the Constitutional Club had owned the premises adjoining the Cosmos, which was now incorporated into the supermarket. The club had had an assembly room in those days, and to the rear, a small bar with tables for refreshments. Mrs. Warburton's description tallied exactly with the club's old refreshment room. The bar, the cinema, and the assembly room had all vanished years ago. Yet, on the 18th of June 1968, Mrs. Warburton had stepped into the past and, like others involved in time slips, had accepted without question the place in which she found herself. Retrospective clairvoyance, it is called. Whatever it is mighty odd to contemplate. Okay, so there's a couple of things about this story that I think are interesting. Firstly, I also would not question if I saw a cafe where there were people who were dressed in out of time period clothing, because I would immediately think, oh, they're people who are doing some sort of LARPing or some sort of, they're part of some sort of club or, amateur theatre, street theatre. I wouldn't question people being in out of place clothing. So I wouldn't be like, oh my God, I've slipped into the past suddenly. So that part of it, I understand why she didn't question it at the time. The thing that I do think is a bit odd about this story, or maybe makes a detail of this story slightly less believable, is that afterwards apparently she remembered that there was no smell of coffee and no sounds of people talking. I don't think that I would remember that detail afterwards. I think if I noticed it immediately at the time, I would be like, oh, that's fucking weird. But I don't think that detail would come back to me at a later date, do you know? Especially not if I didn't think there was anything strange about the situation in the first place. And that's probably me being super nitpicky, but it just was something that stood out to me in this particular story. Isn't it fascinating though that a lot of these time slip stories, people seem to slip into completely inconsequential moments in history. Like the Versailles time slip, it's, Marie Antoinette is there. It's like, oh, this was their last day of freedom. It's a moment in history. It's a really big figure in history that these women allegedly saw. But for the most part, time slip stories are basically just, yeah, I saw this cafe that I thought was actually there and it was full of people just drinking coffee and having a chat about their morning. And then I realised that cafe hasn't been there in years and that's it. Nothing wild or exciting is happening in these time slips, which in a way to me gives them more credence. So I've got another Kent time slip story for you. In 1935, Dr. E.G. Moon, a very down-to-earth Scots physician with a practice in Broadstairs, was at Minster in Thanet visiting his patient Lord Carson, who lived at Cleeve Court, a house that was allegedly haunted. After talking to Carson, the doctor left his patient and made his way downstairs into the hallway. His mind was very clearly occupied at the time with the instructions he had given the nurse about the prescription he had left for Carson. At the front door, Dr. Moon hesitated, wondering whether to go back upstairs to have another word with the nurse. It was at this point that the doctor noted that his car was no longer where he had left it in the driveway. In fact, it had been parked alongside a thick yew hedge, and that too was missing. Even the drive down which he had driven from the main road. was now nothing but a muddy track, and a man was coming towards him. The newcomer on the scene, only 30 yards from Dr. Moon, was rather oddly dressed, wearing an old-fashioned coat with several capes around his shoulders, and he wore a top hat, of the kind seen in the previous century. As he walked, he smacked a switch against his riding boots. Over his shoulder he carried a long-barrelled gun. He stared hard at Moon, and the doctor registered the fact that the man coming towards him might have looked more at home in the 19th century. Remarkably, Dr. Moon seemed not at the time to have been either alarmed or even mildly surprised by the changed scenery, by the quite oddly dressed man approaching him, or the fact that his car was missing. What preoccupied him was the thought of Lord Carson's prescription. He simply turned away without any concern to go back into the house. But he did quite casually take one more look at the scene that he was leaving. And now, as if by magic, the car was back to where it had been, and the yew hedge too. The drive was no longer a muddy track, and the man had also disappeared. Back, one assumes, to the previous century. And it was only now that Dr. Moon realised that something odd, something decidedly odd, had occurred. All of this took seconds, and so there is every reason to understand why Dr. Moon did not immediately go out into the driveway to see where his missing car was. For the same reason, it is understandable why he did not speak to the man dressed like a farm bailiff of the past. Dr. Moon was drawn into some kind of accepting, hallucinatory state. When he came to, for that seems to be the best way of describing his return to his own time, he described to Lady Carson what he thought had occurred. He was anxious, however, that no word of it should come out in his lifetime, for fear that his patients would begin to question his judgment. It was only after his death that the story was revealed. It is difficult to grapple with the notion of time slips. It may be that all past events are impressed into the fabric of buildings, and that in some way, on some occasions, they are released. In other words, what Mrs. Warburton and Dr. Moon saw were ghosts, but not solely of people, but of all their surroundings. Or did Mrs. Warburton and Dr. Moon actually return to a real, physical past? Did they turn up as strangers? Were they really the interlopers at somebody else's present? If so, and this is an intriguing yet unanswerable question, did some people drinking coffee on Saturday morning in a Tunbridge Wells cafe look up and see Mrs. Warburton? Did a man dressed like a farm bailiff walking towards Cleeve Court one day, well over 100 years earlier, see a strangely dressed doctor at the front door of the house? Did the coffee drinkers ever wonder where the elderly lady had so suddenly gone? And did the farm bailiff ask himself how that oddly dressed figure in the doorway had so suddenly disappeared? And that is something that I ask myself regularly when talking about time slip stories, or thinking about time slip stories, or even ghost stories. Who is the intruder in these stories? Do these people of the past notice that something strange has happened? Because we get stories every so often where people feel like the ghost or the entity that they see suddenly realises that the person is there, or suddenly sees the person and they're as shocked to see the living person as the living person is as shocked to see the allegedly dead person. So do these things happen throughout time? Like, are ghosts just a product of time just not being a linear thing? And I really think what these two stories in particular impress upon us is the fact that I don't think, for the most part, you would initially panic. Because you wouldn't initially think, oh my God, I've slipped back into the past, what am I going to do? You'd be like, that's weird. I'm sure I left my car out here. I'm sure there was a yellow yew tree. I'm sure the driveway up to the house looked different. But I don't think I would immediately be like, oh my God, time slip, what am I going to do? I think I would be the same as the doctor. I'd be like, oh, I've got that thing that I need to do. And then when everything went back to normal, I'd be like, well, that was weird. And I think there was a story a couple of weeks ago within the Mumsnet thread of time slips where somebody did realise, this writer did realise, oh my God, I have somehow slipped back to the past and completely panicked. And I think if you realised, it would be an awful feeling, thinking, oh my God, I'm never going to make it back. What if I don't make it back? How does this happen? How does this work? But apparently you make it back. So maybe that's something good to cling to. And the next story number 4, is from listverse.com, and it's a short one. Miss Ruth Wynne, a teacher who in October 1926 took a walk towards the next village, Bradfield St. George, in Suffolk in England, with a female pupil. Quite close to Bradfield's church, they came upon the high walls and wrought iron gates of a grand Georgian house. Much of the building was hidden by tall trees inside the walls. They did not repeat the walk until next spring. On doing so, they found that this grand detached house had completely vanished. Both teacher and pupil confirmed their sighting in reports to the Labour MP Sir Ernest Bennett. On a warm June day, around 1912, a young boy, James Cobbold, was assisting the Rougham butcher George Waylett with deliveries by pony and trap. As they drove along Kingshall Street, the air turned cold. There was a sudden loud whoosh, and the pony reared in terror and threw Waylett from the cart. For just seconds there appeared a 3-storey Georgian house with garden and elaborate flower beds before a mist shrouded it and all was gone. Scrambling up, Waylett yelled, "That bloody house! That's about the 3rd time I've seen that happen." So it would appear that this house, this big Georgian house, has a habit of appearing to people. You know, and this person, Waylett, was like, oh, for fuck's sake. This butcher was like, this is the 3rd time this has happened to me. Every time this house appears, I get flung off my pony. There's a big whoosh. Suddenly this house appears from the past. And I would imagine it would get annoying after the 3rd time. But the idea of this whoosh that, you know, frightens the pony and then the house appears and then is, you know, shrouded in mist and disappears, it sort of signifies that something is actively happening, that these time slips aren't a passive thing, that there is an event that happens for whatever reason that causes this house to appear, whether that's, you know, a perfect storm of, I don't know, weather conditions, temperature, who knows, but something happens that causes this Georgian house to appear, and not just to one person, that it seems to happen regularly. And again, that is something that has come up a number of times on the podcast, where people have seen a house one minute and then it's been gone. And it's not just houses. So in our 5th story, which comes from anomalian.com, describes something that is similar but not in relation to a house. A relaxing drive with friends left Sarah Ryan with a mystery. Sarah was 22 back in 1977 when she and 2 friends decided to drive an area between Savoy and Florida, Massachusetts. The road they took ran alongside the Savoy Mountain State Forest. While many of the small unpaved side roads were unnamed, the 3 grew up in the area and knew them all well. The friends turned off the main road onto one of the side roads they had travelled many times before. The road they chose, as they were aware, was a dead end. At the end of the road was an area of woods which they particularly enjoyed and had walked through on countless occasions. On this day, however, their favourite spot revealed something new, a cemetery, surrounded by a high fence. The first thought to go through Sarah's mind was, who would put a cemetery there? There were no roads leading to it and no signs that anyone other than them ever visited the area. As the 3 friends approached the strange sight and looked through the locked gate, it was obvious that the cemetery was well taken care of. They wondered where the equipment for maintenance was kept, as there were no buildings. The biggest mystery to them was why they had never seen this cemetery before. Unable to enter the cemetery, the 3 decided to return home. The next day, they would return to the site with 2 additional friends. Once again, Sarah drove, taking the exact route they had taken the day before. When they reached the location where they had seen the cemetery, there was nothing. They knew they were in the right spot. It was just that the cemetery, which seemed to suddenly appear, had now vanished. Future attempts to find the mysterious cemetery turned up nothing, and while never forgotten, the event began to fade from Sarah's memory as the years passed. Then, in 2002, some 25 years after Sarah and her friends had seen the vanishing cemetery, she was sitting at her home talking to her son-in-law. Sarah related the story to the young man and got a surprising response. He told Sarah that about 10 years earlier, he and a few others used to ride mini bikes at the same location. They had ridden there so often that the bikes had dug paths into the ground. One day he emerged from the woods on his bike into a small clearing and nearly crashed. Where there had been open land before was now a high fence surrounding a well-kept cemetery. Strangely, the path that he had been riding on went right up to the fence and continued inside. Just as with Sarah and her friends, her son-in-law and his group returned later to try and find the cemetery. They met with the same result. The cemetery had vanished. The path that he had been riding on that led up to the cemetery fence was on open land, just as it had always been before the day they saw the vanishing cemetery. Again, another story about a vanishing and randomly appearing place. But in this case, not a house, a cemetery, which is a pretty substantial thing to see. You know, the people in these stories are not catching glimpses. They are seeing a cemetery and going, that's fucking weird. There was never a cemetery there before, and now there is a cemetery there. How strange. And then going back and realising the cemetery is now not there. And I think that if there had ever been a cemetery in that place, that there would be evidence of the cemetery having been in that place, whether there would be old headstones, etc. Even if it wasn't being maintained, there would be evidence that it had been there. So what if this is a future time slip? Something that they are seeing in years to come, that there is a cemetery in that place, or a completely alternate timeline altogether, where there's woods in this timeline, there's a cemetery in another timeline. Honestly, time slip stories really do melt my little brain. And once I start thinking about them, then I get really panicky and it leads to an existential crisis, genuinely. So we've one more time slip story for you today. And this story also comes from Anomalien. That's really hard to say. Anomalien.com. And again, the links to exactly where I got all these stories are in the description of this episode. The year was 1988, and a young man in Rutherfordton in North Carolina named David Hale was a bit down on his luck. He was unemployed but had high hopes of finding a job very soon. To that end, Hale had obtained a list of possible employers from his local employment office. In pursuit of one of those jobs, Hale found himself lost, driving down a dirt road with no clue as to where he was. David Hale was not only lost, he in fact did not even remember driving onto the dirt road on which he found himself. He was sure that his destination must be near, but all he saw was open fields to his left and woods to his right. Then, a couple of 100 yards ahead, he saw a turn in the road which would take him to the left. As he got closer, he saw that the road turned left and then back to the right. It was at that moment that Hale saw another car coming from the opposite direction. It was travelling far too fast, missed the turn, and ran off the road and into the field. Hale thought, that guy just wrecked a classic car. It did not appear to be a violent crash, but Hale slowed down and pulled over at the sight of the crash. To his amazement, he found nothing, and after a quick look around, he went on his way, hoping to make his appointment on time. The job interview did not go well. Hale could not get the mysterious car wreck out of his mind, But the interview ended and Hale headed back home. He waited to go back onto the dirt road, hoping to once again check for the car accident. He never ran onto a dirt road, but he did come to the curve where he had witnessed the car go off the road. This time he found it. The strange thing was that the car was in fact a 1940s model, but it had been in that field for many years. The paint was gone and the tyres were rotted. David Hale never figured out what happened to him that day back in 1988. He is not alone, however, as in what appears to be increasing numbers, people are reporting the very much unexplained phenomena of time slips. I don't for a second believe that this is what David Hale did in his interview, but all I could imagine was him going into the interview not going well, and him going, look, I'm really sorry. I'm not really on my best for this interview. What do you guys think of time slips? Because you're not going to believe it, but on the way here, something really weird happened. As somebody who is detrimentally honest, that is exactly what would happen to me. If I experience something weird on the way to the interview, I'll be like, you will not believe what happened to me on the way here. No, seriously. I know the interview is serious and I would very much like to get this job, but I kind of need to tell you guys about this. In this story, you could kind of say, it's a moment in time that's being replayed over and over again, which is fair. He sees this classic car being crashed into a field. That's a pretty significant moment in time. But it's the fact that he's driving along this dirt road that does not exist, which makes it kind of more significant. It makes it feel like, no, he actually went back in time. He's not just seeing a moment in time, he is in that moment in time. Time slips they're fascinating, but they are really scary. Anyway, like I said at the top of the episode, I apologise if you've heard any of these stories before on this podcast specifically. It's been 5 years. It's been a lot of episodes. I can't always keep track of what I cover and what I don't. I also apologise if this episode has hurt your brain in any way, because it has definitely hurt mine. And as always, all the links to all of the stories that I used today are in the description of this episode. Thank you so much for listening to today's episode. If you would like to send in your story, you can do so by emailing it to reallifeghoststoriespodcast@gmail.com. You can also check out the website reallifeghoststoriespodcast.com. And if you are desperate for some extra content, you can subscribe to the Patreon. That is patreon.com/reallifeghoststories, where for $5 a month or $2 a month, you get access to heaps of extra content, as well as every single main and mini episode completely ad-free. And on that note, I shall see you next time.
Why don't more infant formula companies use organic, grass-fed whole milk instead of skim? Why don't more infant formula companies use the latest breast milk science? Why don't more infant formula companies run their own clinical trials? Why don't more infant formula companies use more of the proteins found in breast milk? Why don't more infant formula companies have their own factories instead of outsourcing their manufacturing? We wondered the same thing. So we made ByHeart, a better formula for formula. Learn more at byheart.com.